On the night of November the 10th, Sean Jameson was shot in the head, causing concussion and a severe scalp wound by Paul Brimmer. Brimmer, a farmer in the village of Wenderby near Fulchester, claims it was an accident and that he thought he was shooting at a fox. The police, however, have brought a charge of attempted murder and a charge of wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. Jameson and his girlfriend, Angela Burke, had been squatting in a derelict cottage on the farmer's land. They maintain that Brimmer had ordered them off his property and threatened them on 2 occasions. The implication is that the shooting was intentional and deliberate. In the witness box, Sean Jameson.
Mr. Jameson, would you tell the court what happened on the night the accused came to the cottage?
Well, he'd been there for quite some time before I knew it. I was in the back room having a sleep and it was Angie's voice woke me. When I came in, I didn't know what was happening at first. Angie was crying and your man stood there, angry like. I didn't know who he was, you see. And he'd torn down the window coverings that I'd fixed up.
My lord, may we establish whether or not this witness claims he saw my client tear these down?
Did you see this happen, Mr. Jameson?
No, Your Lordship, I didn't see it myself, but Angie told me.
Yes, Mr. Jameson, you must tell the court what you personally saw, not what some other person reported to you. Try to keep this in mind.
I will, Your Lordship, yes.
That's all right. Now, please continue.
Well, he was in there and he was shouting at Angie. And I went up to him and asked him who he thought he was going on like that at her. And he said, I'm the owner of this place, that's who I am, and I want you out of it. Well, I was angry with him, you know, for making Angie cry and everything. But I thought there's no sense in a shouting match. So I said, why don't we sit down and talk it over, you know, quiet like, be sensible about it. But he wouldn't have that. He went on ranting and raving at us. And then he said, don't say I didn't warn you. And out he goes.
Well, let us come now to the night of the shooting, Mr. Jameson. Would you tell the jury exactly what happened?
The thing is, I don't remember exactly what happened when he shot me or just before he shot me. The doctor said I got the amnesia from this concussion in my head. I was in the hospital for a month with this thing.
Well, just tell us what you can remember. For instance, what time was it when you got back to the farm that evening?
Well, it would have been about 9 o'clock, I think. I'd had no luck looking for work all day. I went into the White Hart in Wenderby for a couple of pints and a chat, and then I started home. When I got to the farm, I lost my way. I couldn't find the path that led to the cottage, you know?
Why was that, Mr. Jameson? You must have made that trip several times from the village during the week you'd been there?
It was a different path, Your Lordship. You see, Angie told me to come to the back door so she'd know it was me and not your man again.
And what do you remember next, Mr. Jameson?
I couldn't find any path at all for ages. Then I saw this little track, like, and I started to follow that. The next thing I know, I'm lying in a ditch and Angie's beside me crying and carrying on, like, and this terrible pain in my head. There were other people there that I didn't know, but I seen your man all right. I asked, what happened to me? And Angie said, he shot you, he tried to kill you. I must have passed out then, because that's all I remember till I woke up in the hospital.
Thank you, Mr. Jameson.
Just a minute.
Would you wait there, please?
Mr. Jameson, you testified that you were 22 years of age, didn't you?
That's right, yes.
Yes, Miss Burke is somewhat older than you, I believe.
Angie's about 30, I think.
32 from the deposition. Yes, 32 it says here. 10 years different. Now, when did you first meet Miss Burke, Mr. Jameson? How did you meet?
It was in a pub next door to where she lives in Camden Town. I was having a quiet drink in there and somebody started a fight. It wasn't me, Your Lordship, but I was one of the ones that they threw out. Angie followed me out and we started talking. She said she knew it wasn't my fault and we got, you know, talking. And she said there was an empty room in the house she lived in that I could crash in.
Just a minute. That he could what in, Mr. Golding?
Crash in, Your Lordship. camp out, as you might say, till I could find a place of my own.
Which you did not, in fact, do, but moved into Miss Burke's room with her.
Yes, I did. Anything wrong with that?
And for this period, she was supporting you?
We shared.
Oh, so you had regular employment?
Look, it's not easy getting jobs in London, you know. I'd only been there 3 months before I met Angie, and I'd had 4 jobs. Well, none of them were any good, so I had to get some help from the welfare.
Yes, you do have a police record, I believe, Mr. Jameson.
I don't know about records, sir. I was booked 2 times by the police in London, but it wasn't for anything serious.
Oh, once on September the 7th, 1973 for drunken disorderly conduct, and once on October the 11th, 1973 for vagrancy. Now that is right, isn't it?
That's right.
Yes. And I understand that you were on probation for 1 year in Ireland on shoplifting charges. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Now, how much money had you between you when you left London? Enough for your fares, for a night's lodging?
We only had a couple of pounds. We hitched up. Then we saw this cottage and nobody was using it,
And so you simply settled there knowing it was private property?
Look, we didn't know at first.
No? Oh, you thought no one owned it at all, did you?
Well, no, but
Of course not. You knew you were trespassing.
My lord, I think we ought to...
Angie said we had squatters' rights.
Squatters' rights? Did you not realize that you had no rights at all? If Mr. Brimmer had gone to a court for a possession order, you would have been obliged to have left straight away. Mr. Brimmer could have taken you to court. Well, let's get on.
Yes. Mr. Jameson, you had been drinking quite considerably on the evening that Mr. Brimmer arrived at the cottage, hadn't you?
No, I hadn't. I just had a couple of pints when I was in the village buying the food.
Oh? And you were wakened by the sound of Miss Burke's voice, you said?
That's right, yes.
Well, if Mr. Brimmer was in such a violent temper as you say, it would surely have seemed more likely that it would have been his voice that woke you. At any rate, when you emerged, you found Miss Burke in a very excitable state, would you say?
She was annoyed, like I said.
And angry?
Well, she stood up to him all right. She told him to get out and leave us alone.
Oh? She told him to get out?
Well, that was after he started shouting.
Well, at exactly what point did you suggest that you all sit down and talk things over quietly?
Well, I don't remember exactly. It was all happening at once.
Yes.
He was calling Angie names and Angie was crying and...
Mr. Jameson, it seems that your recollections of this occasion are somewhat confused. Now, my client will testify that it was not he, but it was you and Miss Burke who behaved in this threatening and abusive manner. My client is facing a very serious charge. Now, this charge is largely based on threats he is alleged to have made against you and Miss Burke. And because of these alleged threats, the case of an unfortunate shooting accident has been transformed into one of attempted murder.
Accident? Would you take a good look at me? I'm near enough 6 foot tall. How could anybody mistake me for a fox and a full moon shining?
Mr. Jameson, would you oblige me by turning your head to the right? Thank you. I would like his lordship and the jury to see clearly the colour of your hair. Thank you, Mr. Jameson. I suggest that because you were drunk, you fell backwards into that ditch before my client was anywhere near you, so that when he did come that way, on the lookout for a fox, and saw the moonlight glinting on your red hair, it is hardly surprising that he thought you were the fox. I have no more questions, thank you.
Can you remember just how much you did have to drink that night, Mr. Jameson?
4 pints at the very most, sir. You can ask them in the pub, they'll tell you.
So you were not intoxicated?
No, sir, I was not. Anyway, it's a matter of pride with me that no matter how much I have to drink, I still stay standing on my feet. I'm like me dad that way. It's a family thing, you know.
How old were you when you were put on probation in Ireland?
14 and a half, sir.
And were you guilty of shoplifting?
Yes, sir, I was. It was stupid, you know. Like gang of kids just being stupid. My dad was angry with me that time, I'll tell you.
And you left school at 15 and you worked on your father's farm until you came to London?
There was all this talk back home about hundreds of building jobs in London and very high wages. I could tell them. The second time I was knocked off, I thought I'd just walk out of London and find the countryside and a farm where I'd get work. But I walked and it still went on being London, so I had to give that up.
And how about this charge of disorderly conduct? Would you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
I was singing, sir.
Singing?
Singing. I met this fella from County Kerry and he stood me a few drinks in a pub. He was the first person who talked to me, you know, friendly like, since I came to London. Anyway, after closing time, we were walking through the streets and we started singing, you know. We were making a good deal of noise, I suppose. Anyway, we came to this place called Mayfair and the police came and locked us up for the night. And they'll tell you I was still standing on my feet that time, not a good sight more than 4 pints taken.
And this later charge of vagrancy?
Well, I was out of work. I got some money from the welfare, but they didn't have any jobs, you know. I didn't know what I was going to do. I got very depressed, like, you know, low. I'd get a cup of tea in the mornings and then I'd buy a ticket on the tube trains and ride around all day. Then at night I took to sleeping on benches down there and they gave me 7 days for that.
And it was shortly after that that you met Miss Burke?
Oh, it was the same day I came out of the nick. Do you know, I was scared to go down on them trains again. All them people there and nobody talking to you, you know. I thought I might go off my head entirely. Like. So I just walked around all day and then I came to the pub and then there was the fight and I was one of the ones that was chucked out. You wouldn't blame them, I suppose. I was looking a bit rough.
And it was then that Miss Burke took you in?
She did. She'd no need to bother with the likes of me. She's got a university education, you know. But she didn't mind me looking so rough. She asked me all about myself. She was interested. She wanted to know, you know. I've never met anybody like Angie before. Never.
Angela Burke, please. Miss Burke, would you tell the jury what happened on the night of November the 10th, please?
Yes, I was waiting in the cottage for Sean. I suppose it must have been about 9:30 when I heard a shot. I was frightened and I ran out to see what had happened. There was a clear moon. It was a very clear night. And I saw that man, Brimmer, running. He had a gun in his hand. I ran after him and I nearly fell over Sean. He'd fallen into a ditch and his head was bleeding. He wasn't moving. I thought he was dead.
Did you say anything to the accused?
Yes, I shouted at him to come back.
And did he come back?
Yes, he said it was an accident, but I knew it wasn't. He'd shot Sean and he was running away.
Yes, Miss Burke, expressing opinions and drawing conclusions have no place in your testimony. Your function here is to relate only the facts.
Yes, of course. I'm sorry, my
That's
lord.
quite all right. Now, please continue.
Then his wife came running up, and he said he'd go and telephone for the doctor, but I wouldn't let him.
Why not?
I thought he might try and escape. I told her to go instead, and I told her to call the police, too.
And when Police Constable Lakin and Dr. Walker arrived from Wenderby, now, did you repeat your accusations against the accused?
Yes, of course.
Now, Miss Burke, why were you so positive that this was not an accident, that the accused had shot Mr. Jameson deliberately?
Because he'd threatened us.
How and when had he threatened you?
He came to the cottage twice.
Now, would you tell the jury about these 2 visits, please?
Yes, the first time was after we'd been in the cottage for about a week. Sean had brought some food back from the village and I was getting it ready. He was asleep in the other room. Then the front door was suddenly sort of burst open. It broke the string latch we'd put up. And he just burst in. He asked me who I was and what I was doing. And he was angry and very unpleasant. I mean, it was all so mad. Why was he so angry? We weren't hurting the place. Nobody'd lived there for years. Honestly, if you could have seen the place, just a broken-down little place.
My lord, at this point, I would like to submit a photograph of this cottage. Be Exhibit 2, my lord.
Yes.
In fact, you and Mr. Jameson had done some repairs, I believe.
Yes, we had. Sean had found some bits of wood and plastic to mend the windows. I told him that. I showed him.
How did he respond to that?
It was all so odd. He looked at it, then he started tearing the stuff down. I mean, they said in the village he was a bit of an eccentric, but in my opinion he was some kind of paranoid hysteric.
Miss Burke.
Sorry, I didn't think.
Did all this noise awaken Mr. Jameson?
Yes, it did. He came out and tried to calm things down and talk things over quietly. But he just went on shouting things. And then he went.
And what about the accused's second visit to the cottage, Miss Burke?
Well, that was the next day, the day he tried to kill Sean. I mean the day the shooting happened. It was about noon. Sean had gone out early. I was picking up bits of wood outside the cottage for firewood. I didn't realise he was there at first. He came up so quietly. Then I turned round and saw him. He was just standing there staring at me. He was sort of grim. He looked hatchet-faced. And he was carrying a gun.
And what did he say?
Not very much. He asked me why we hadn't got out, and I said, hadn't he heard of squatters' rights? And he said he didn't know what I was talking about and that we had no rights at all. Then he said, I'm warning you, you two get out of here today. I don't want your kind on my property. I won't have vermin like you on my land. Then he walked off.
Did the accused at any time suggest that he might call in the police to help evict you?
No, he never mentioned the police.
And did you ever think of using police protection?
No, I was a squatter for a year before I moved to the CHP. The police are always on the side of the landlord.
CHP?
Community Housing Project, where I was living when I met Sean. A group of us started it 2 years ago. We persuaded the local council to let us take over a crescent of houses that was due for demolition.
Take over in what way exactly?
Well, they let us have the use of the crescent before it was demolished. We set up an office and we let rooms at very low rents, between £1 and £3 a week.
I see. Interesting idea.
Yes.
Miss Burke, you worked in a residential home for mentally retarded children in Sweden for a year from 1969, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And when you returned to England in 1971, you helped to organise and run an advice centre for immigrants in Birmingham for a year?
That's right.
And then you came to London and you became involved in this community housing project?
Yes.
It's a very impressive record. Thank you, Miss Burke.
Miss Burke, I've listened to you with the greatest interest, and I cannot but think that you're wasting your time and talent on all this worthy social work. You would have made an excellent novelist. Your version of my client's first visit to the cottage was totally distorted. And as to the second visit, Miss Burke, there was no second visit.
That's just not true. He did come. I saw him and I talked to him.
Miss Burke, this preposterous scene you describe of hatchet-faced landowners and guns and threats and cries of vermin might have come straight out of a 19th century melodrama.
I tell you, he was there.
And I tell you, Miss Burke, and Mr. Paul Brimmer will tell you himself that he was not. And as to the first and only visit, it was you and Jameson who were abusive and aggressive, not my client.
No, we weren't.
It was you who flew into a violent rage. It was you who tore down these window coverings. And it was Jameson who came out and was abusive and threatening to my client, not the other way round as you would have us believe.
Surely Sean must have told you what happened.
Of course, Miss Burke, of course he has. And naturally your stories tally perfectly. You've prepared them well, and Mr. Jameson's version of the facts is a very faithful copy of your own.
Are you suggesting, Mr. Golding, that Miss Burke has put words into Mr. Jameson's mouth?
Well, my lord, if, as I believe, they have fabricated their description of my client's behaviour on that evening, I would suggest that the intelligence behind this fabrication is Miss Burke's.
I see. He's gone.
My lord. Now, we've heard from Mr. Jameson that you and he had known each other for only 2 or 3 days before you began living together. Are you in the habit of picking up young men in the street?
My lord.
Yes, Mr. Dealey. I think you might have to rephrase that question, Mr.
There's no
Golding.
need, my lord. As he's obviously interested in my sexual habits, I'd like to add that I'm not a promiscuous person. I've only lived with a man once before, for a year in Birmingham. It didn't work out.
Thank you, Miss Burke. Now, I'm a little muddled about all these dates you've given us. Perhaps we might clarify this impressive record that my learned friend has referred to. You completed your teacher training course after university in 1964, did you not?
Yes.
Yes, and a year's teaching brings us to 1965. Mm-hmm. And my learned friend then told us that you went to Sweden in 1969.
That's right.
Well, we seem to have skipped rather rapidly across these ensuing years. A lot of very important things happened to you between 1965 and 1969, didn't they? For example, in May 1965, you married Mr. Mark Hayes. And in February 1966, you gave birth to a baby son. And in December 1966, Mr. Hayes brought divorce proceedings against you, which were uncontested, and which he won together with care, control, and custody of your son.
My lord, I really can't see how these private and painful details of Miss Burke's past life have any relevance to these proceedings.
Is this necessary, Mr. Golding?
My lord, counsel for the prosecution has given us an incomplete picture of Miss Burke's history. I wish only to give a complete one.
Very well. Well, let's get on.
My lord, the fact is, Miss Burke, that Mark Hayes divorced you in December 1966 because you had become a heroin addict. And that after a serious collapse the following March, you were admitted to the drug addiction unit of Walworth Hospital in Hartford, where you were a patient for 14 months. Now, do you deny any of this, Miss Burke?
No. But it's not the whole picture
Thank you.
either.
I have no further questions.
My lord, he can't just say all that and not give me a chance to give my side of it, can he?
It's all right. There is no need for anxiety on your part, Miss Burke. Your side of it can be put in re-examination by Mr. Dealey.
I'm sorry I didn't tell you all that, but I didn't expect it to come up. But now that it has, I would like to say something about it, if that's all right.
Please, Miss Burke, tell the court whatever you wish about it.
Well, it's just that people have such strong feelings about drugs. I mean, because they usually don't know much about it, they find it frightening. And because of that, they tend to be, well, revolted by it, disgusted. I mean, people are always saying dope fiend, aren't they? As if a drug addict wasn't human, especially if it's a woman for some reason. Though I suppose that's mostly historical conditioning, really. The way people find a drunk woman repellent and a drunk man rather funny.
No, my lord, I cannot think that a general lecture on social values is called for here.
Yes, Miss Burke, what we wish you to do is to explain your own circumstances.
Yes, my lord. Well, the important thing is that he left out was in September 1966, Mark's parents appeared out of the blue and took my baby away with them up to Yorkshire where they lived. Mark was an only child and his parents disliked me very much. And I found out later that he'd been writing to them and telephoning them up, complaining about me. And one of the things that he told his father was that he found me smoking dope, cannabis.
Was this true?
Yes, it was. I'm afraid I'm not in the least bit ashamed of it, my lord. If you don't mind my saying so, I think the laws on soft drugs are ludicrous.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
cannabis isn't anything like as dangerous as alcohol.
Yes.
But I imagine you don't want me to give you a general lecture on that either.
No, thank you, Miss Burke.
Well, we lived on this ghastly housing estate outside Hatfield in Hertfordshire. Well, Mark was out nearly all the time. His job was 40 miles away. And I was left alone with a baby. I didn't mind that. I was terribly fond of the baby. But I just got fantastically lonely. Anyway, some friends of mine from Cambridge turned up one evening, and yes, we smoked some dope together. Anyway, Mark's father was horrified, thunderstruck, and declared me an unfit mother and came and took my baby away from me.
And the heroin addiction, Miss Burke, when was that?
Yes, well, I am ashamed about that. But I was very young and I was desperate, you know. And I met this girl on the housing estate. I think people would be very surprised if they found out how many hard drug addicts there are on housing estates. Well, she started me on heroin. But I admitted myself to the Walworth Hospital to get off it. Nobody put me there.
And were you successful?
Yes.
Mr. Dealey?
Well, let us return briefly now to the accused's visits to the cottage, Miss Burke. And my learned friend has expressed considerable doubt that the second visit took place at all.
Well, I can only say again that it did. He's right, it was all very melodramatic. But he did come to the cottage, and he did have a gun, and he did call us vermin. And you could see by his face that's just what he thought of us. Not people, but something nasty and dangerous to be cleared off his land.
The case of the Queen against Brimmer will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court. The trial of Mr. Paul Brimmer, a farmer in the village of Wenderby near Fulchester, enters its second day in the Crown Court. Mr. Brimmer is charged with attempted murder and with wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. He admits to shooting at Sean Jameson, a young Irishman who was squatting with his girlfriend on Brimmer's land, but maintains that he mistook Jameson for a fox. The prosecution claims that because, as both Jameson and his girlfriend Angela Burke have testified, Brimmer made 2 visits to the cottage they'd taken over and threatened them, that the shooting was intentional. Mr. Bremer's counsel has come up with the information that Sean Jameson has a police record for vagrancy and for drunk and disorderly conduct, and that Angela Burke is an ex-heroin addict. Constable Lakin, the local policeman from the village of Wenderby, is in the witness box.
Constable Lakin, can you tell the court what Miss Burke said to you?
Yes, sir. She said, "Please arrest that man, Constable. He tried to kill my friend." The accused then said, "That's a lie. I thought he was a fox. It was an accident." I then asked Miss Burke why she thought the shooting was deliberate, and she said, "He's been to our cottage twice and threatened us. The last time was this morning. He had a gun." The accused then said, "That's a lie too. I was nowhere near that cottage today."
Did the accused say anything further in your presence?
Not to me, didn't, sir. No, not another word. But I heard him say something while the doctor was attending to the young man, more to himself like. I jotted it down.
What was that?
He said, "I warned them. They were trespassing."
Constable, you're quite sure that those were his exact words?
Positive, sir.
Constable Lakin, can you give us any information about the previous good character of Mr. Paul Brimmer?
Mr. Golding, have you any objection to this kind of question?
Oh, my lord, I have been forewarned, and I've reached the conclusion that I had no valid objection.
Oh, very well, officer.
Well, sir, on May the 22nd, 1972, Mr. Brimmer was charged with assault. A firearm was involved. He was found guilty and fined.
Would you give us some details of this offence? You were present in court.
Oh, yes, sir. On May the 14th, 3 boys, all aged between 17 and 19, said they'd been walking across one of Mr. Brimmer's fields. He'd shouted at them to get off, threatened them with a gun, and then fired it over their heads.
And what was Mr. Brimmer's defence?
He said the gun had gone off by accident, sir.
Thank you, Constable.
Yes. Members of the jury, I must stress that this evidence of Mr. Brimmer's previous conviction for discharging a gun near to some youths is admissible in this trial only because he raised the same defence then as now, namely accident. Yes?
Constable Lakin, you were present at the Magistrates' Court on July the 4th, 1972?
I was, sir.
Yes, now I have a note of the hearing with me. You will remember how Mr. Brimmer pleaded?
Yes, sir. He pleaded not guilty.
Yes, and you will perhaps recall that in his testimony he said that the boys concerned were deliberately causing damage to a young barley crop, that he had started to run and they had run, and when he saw them, he'd run after them, and that then the gun had somehow gone off because he was running with it.
He did say that, sir, yes.
And he maintained at all times that he was completely innocent of that charge.
Yes, sir.
And then 18 months later, you were again called out to Mr. Brimmer's farm to deal with another incident concerning a gun. Now, doesn't it seem very unlikely to you, Constable Lakin, that after once having been found guilty on a firearm charge, Mr. Brimmer would be so foolhardy as to deliberately fire at a trespasser?
Well, I didn't really think of it in that way, sir. I was just aware of the coincidence, as you might say.
I think you will agree that a man would be reckless indeed to run such a risk after having been convicted of an offence so similar. Now, let us return to the night of November the 10th. Was Mr. Brimmer cooperative and amenable?
Oh, yes, sir. He made no objection to coming down to the station. He was very quiet altogether, sir.
Yes. Now, Constable Lakin, about this phrase you overheard my client say to himself, you have testified that it was 2 sentences. First, I warned them, and then they were trespassing.
That's what he said, sir, yes.
Well, I suggest that what Mr. Brimmer said was not 2 sentences, but 1. I warned them they were trespassing. Not a threat, but a statement of fact about a previous warning. Now, I suggest that is what he said. Do you agree?
I'm afraid I don't, sir. It sounded to me like 2 separate sentences.
But you would allow for the possibility, Constable, would you not, that as my client was speaking, as it were, in a very low tone, that it could have been only 1 sentence?
Well, I could allow for the possibility, sir. Yes.
You could allow for the possibility. Thank you, Constable. I have no further questions.
I have no re-examination, my lord.
Thank you, officer.
I'd like to call Dr. Bridget Walker, please.
Dr. Bridget Walker, please.
You are Dr. Bridget Walker of Grove Cottage, Wenderby?
I am.
And you are a registered medical practitioner living and working in Wenderby for the past 11 years.
Yes.
Now, you attended at Mr. Brimmer's farm on the night of November the 10th.
Yes, I did.
Would you tell us what condition Mr. Jameson was in, please?
He was quite severely concussed and had a deep scalp wound about 4 inches long which required stitches.
Now, I understand that Mr. Jameson's position in the ditch had not been significantly changed after he'd been discovered. Now, would you describe his position for us?
Yes, he was lying on his back with the weight of his body on his right side in a rather awkward position. I asked Miss Burke particularly if she had moved him, and she said no, except to slip her sweater under his head.
Did you make a sketch of this position?
Yes.
And do you now produce it?
Yes.
Would you, thank you.
Yes, I included that sketch in the notes I gave to the police.
This will be Exhibit 3, my lord.
Yes.
Now, you will note that there is an X marked on this sketch which indicates the conjectured position at which Mr. Jameson was standing when the bullet struck him.
Who was it who placed the mark X on this sketch?
Dr. Walker, my lord.
Yes. Can you tell me how you calculated the position of this mark, Doctor?
Yes, my lord. It seemed to me most likely that in response to the impact of the bullet, Mr. Jameson would be thrown about 10 or 12 inches to his right. His feet going out from under him, causing him to slide feet first into the ditch and come to rest in the position in which I found him.
These calculations are, however, based on conjecture, Doctor.
Oh, yes, it was a question of guesswork from the evidence available.
Yeah.
But I have had considerable experience of bullet wounds.
Oh?
You see, I served in a field hospital from 1944 to 45.
I see. I think we can accept this evidence from Dr. Walker with that experience. Hey, Mr. Golding.
Well, I'm prepared to reserve any objection at this stage, my lord, but I will submit that this evidence is inconclusive.
Oh, really? Yes, Mr. Dealey.
Dr. Walker, in your examination of the victim, did you make any observations as to the angle and direction at which the bullet struck Mr. Jameson's head?
Yes, I did. The bullet struck the head on the left side, fractionally above the left eye. The furrow caused by the bullet ran in more or less a straight line along the side of the head to about an inch above the ear.
Now, Mr. Jameson and the accused are of about the same height. Now, would that suggest to you that they were both standing when the bullet was fired?
That would seem the most likely supposition to me.
You assume Mr. Jameson was standing when the bullet struck him.
Yes, my lord.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. Would you wait there, please?
Now, Dr. Walker, you've described the way in which you consider Jameson would have fallen had he been standing when the bullet struck him. But you did not include the alternative observation that as Jameson was very intoxicated at the time, he might well have stumbled and fallen into the ditch before the shot was fired.
Well, I wasn't asked to make any observations on the possibility of intoxication until now. But it seems somewhat unlikely to me that a man would fall, or stumble, as you say, in such a way as to end up on his back. It seems more probable that he would pitch forward and land face down. Of course, this can only be speculation.
Yes. Now, Dr. Walker, this sketch shows that Jameson was lying on a slant, his head higher than his feet.
Yes, he was.
Yes. And as the grade of the slope is shown here, the head would have been about 10 or 12 inches above his feet. Is that right?
Yes, about that, I would say.
Yes, well, my client will testify that he saw no man at all, that he was on the lookout for a fox, and that he took what he took to be red fur in the ditch and fired from a kneeling position. Now, would you look at this photograph, Dr. Walker? Thank you. This is a photograph taken of the area in which the incident occurred. Now, on the right, the ditch where Jameson lay. And on the left, a mark showing where my client knelt to fire the gun. Now, you will see from the measurements marked that my client was kneeling in a dip of lower ground, and that this would bring the gun and Jameson's head to about the same level and result in the more or less straight path of the wound as you have described.
It's possible, yes.
Yes. My lord, this photograph had better be admitted as Exhibit 4.
Yes. Thank you. Now, Mr. Golding, I take it that the mark in this photograph is made from Mr. Brimmer's recollection of his position when he fired.
Yes, my lord.
There's no other evidence to position it apart from his own memory.
No, my lord.
Yes, right, please. Members of the jury, when you examine this photograph, I ask you to bear in mind that the mark on the left of the picture referred to by learned counsel is made by the prisoner's own recollection. There is no corroborative evidence.
You have reason, I believe, Dr. Walker, to dislike Paul Brimmer very much.
I don't dislike Mr. Brimmer. What makes you say that?
In June 1972, you paid a visit to my client's house on the pretext of wishing to examine Mrs. Brimmer. Now, you had not been asked by either Mr. or Mrs. Brimmer to make this house call, and Mr. Brimmer objected to your presence. There was an argument, you became very angry, and Mr. Brimmer was forced to ask you to leave his house. Now, that is all right, isn't it?
Yes, that's quite true.
Doctor, there was no explicit request that you should visit the Brimmers' house.
No, but I had a strong instinctive feeling that Mrs. Brimmer was asking for my help.
In what way, Doctor?
Well, she'd come to my surgery the day before, complaining of a sore throat, and I prescribed a Linctus. However, she was also suffering from a very badly bruised jaw. When I questioned her about this, she seemed uneasy and evasive. She said something about trying to shut a window in a high wind and it banging against the side of her face. She let me examine her jaw and admitted that she had been anxious about the possibility of some kind of permanent injury. But there was no fracture. It was only bruised and swollen.
So, in your opinion, the sore throat was only a pretext?
Yes, she knew that I would ask about her jaw, and the window story seemed highly unlikely to me. If that had happened, the whole side of her face would have been affected, not just her jaw.
Indeed, you had a theory as to what might have caused this injury, didn't you, Doctor?
I thought her husband might have hit her.
But you had no proof or evidence of this quite malicious theory.
My theory was not based on malice, but on my experience. I'm very sorry to say that this is not at all an unusual situation in my surgery. A lot of wives have come to me with inadequate and unlikely explanations of injuries. Too proud or perhaps too frightened to make any direct complaint against their husbands.
Yes, thank you for your speculations and conjectures about the private lives of your patients, Doctor. I have no further questions.
I have no re-examination, my lord.
Thank you. You may go, Doctor.
That is the case for the prosecution, my lord.
To open the case for the defence, my lord, I would like, with your permission, to call a witness before my client gives evidence. Now, this witness has travelled from Yorkshire, and it would be professionally most inconvenient for him if he were required to stay for another night.
Have you any objection, Mr. Dealey?
No, my lord, defence counsel has already mentioned this to me.
All right, Mr. Golding.
I call Mr. Gerard Yates.
Gerard Yates, please.
You are Gerard Manley Yates, minister of the First Methodist Church in Darnley, Yorkshire.
Yes, I am, yes.
And have you known Paul Brimmer for some years?
Oh, a long time, yes. Ever since I first moved up to Darnley during the war. 30 years, thereabouts, yes. He was a regular chapel-goer.
Yes. And have you been in touch with Mr. Brimmer since he left Darnley and came to Wenderby in 1971?
Oh, yes, indeed. A friendship, you know, of such long standing. We exchange Christmas cards, and I have a permanent invitation to come and stay at the new farm.
Mr. Yates, will you tell the court of Mr. Brimmer's reputation?
Yes, of course. I think I would describe Paul Brimmer as a truly upright man, honest, hard-working, and with a very strict moral sense. Oh, very strict.
Yes, a law-abiding man, would you say?
Indeed, yes, absolutely.
Now, what was your reaction to hearing that Mr. Brimmer had been accused of attempted murder?
Absolute astonishment. Complete astonishment. Such a thing seems totally out of character with the man I know. The idea of Paul Brimmer as a murderer, it's quite unthinkable. When I say he is a law-abiding man, that is putting it very mildly, I assure you. Oh, he has always been totally uncompromising where the law is concerned. As a matter of fact, during the last year of the war, he actually reported his own brother to the police for black market activities. Oh, very minor activities, I should add, yes, but against the law.
Yes, Mr. Yates, Paul Brimmer lived all his life in Darnley?
Yes.
Do you know what the reason was for his making the decision to move south?
Yes, I do. Mr. and Mrs. Brimmer's son, Thomas, was killed very suddenly. He was in the army, shot by a sniper in Belfast. Their only child, very tragic business.
Yes, so they decided to leave their village with its painful memories and associations and to make a fresh start somewhere new.
Well, yes. Mainly on Mrs. Brimmer's account, I think. Paul didn't really want to leave Darnley, but his wife was quite shattered, you see.
Shattered?
Yes, yes. Oh, she became quite disturbed and irrational for some time after the death. A sort of nervous breakdown, you know. Understandable.
Yes, indeed. So it's perhaps not surprising that in moving to a strange place late in their lives and after such a sad occurrence, that they should have lived this rather reclusive way.
Oh, not at all surprising, no. A wound like that takes a long time to heal. And Paul Brimmer himself was never what you, how would you describe it, a gregarious person. And, of course, his wife was really not at all well.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Yates. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
You say that Mr. Brimmer was never a very gregarious person, Mr. Yates. Is that perhaps because he was not a very popular man in Darnley?
Oh, no, I didn't mean to imply that. Oh, no, I think on the whole he was always much respected.
You said that after the death of her son, Mrs. Brimmer became quite disturbed and irrational. In what way?
Oh, people often respond in very untypical and distorted ways to a very close death. That has often been my experience.
And how was Mrs. Brimmer's response to this tragedy untypical or distorted?
Well, as I said, she was not herself. She blamed her husband for Thomas's death.
Do you know why she should do that?
Oh, she was in a state of grave shock. She had some sort of idea that if her husband had let Thomas go to university, instead of insisting that he remain on the farm, well, perhaps he might never have gone off and joined the army at all.
Mr. Yates, are you aware that in 1972 Mr. Brimmer was charged with firing a gun over the heads of some ewes that were on his land and found guilty?
What? Oh, I can't believe it.
Mr. Brimmer pleaded not guilty to the charge and said the gun had gone off by accident.
Ah, well, in that case, although I know it's not my place to say so, I would certainly believe that he was telling the truth.
Yes, well, I'm afraid neither you nor Mr. Brimmer can challenge the finding of the court that he was guilty.
Oh, no, of course not. No.
Mr. Yates, you've told us that Paul Brimmer is an almost obsessively law-abiding man, and yet less than 6 months after leaving the village where he'd lived all his life as a respected citizen, he is convicted of a crime. Now, given his temperament and the feeling that the law had let him down, does it not seem possible to you that on the night of November the 10th, he could have been angry enough to take the law into his own hands?
I am not able to believe that the man I have known for so many years could possibly commit such a sin.
Surely, Mr. Yates, we're all capable of sin.
Yes, as you say, no man is infallible.
Of course. Thank you, Mr. Yates.
I have no re-examination, my lord.
Thank you, Mr. Yates. You may leave the court whenever you wish.
I call Mr. Paul Brimmer.
What is your religion?
Methodist.
Take the book in your right hand and read aloud the words on this card.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Paul Thomas Brimmer of Northways Farm, Wenderby?
I am.
Yes. Now, Mr. Brimmer, would you tell the court exactly what happened on the night of the 10th of November, 1973?
Well, I left my house at about 9:15. I was going to try and get a fox that had been stealing my chickens. I was walking in the direction of the chicken house when I heard a rustling in a ditch about 30 yards ahead of me. And then I saw the moonlight shining on what I thought was red fur, so I got down and fired.
And how soon did you realize that it was not a fox?
Well, right off, after the bullet hit. There was a big sudden movement in the leaves, too much noise for a fox.
Yes, and what did you do?
Well, I ran over to the ditch and saw it was a man.
Did you recognize him?
Yeah, it was a young fella who were living in my cottage.
And what did you do then?
It's somewhat of a blur in my mind. I was thunderstruck. It came as a big shock knowing that I'd hit a man. I think I just stood there staring for a minute or two. I couldn't believe it. And I got down and had a look at him. He was unconscious, but he was still breathing. So I got up and started off to the house to fetch help. And that's when she came running up and stopped me.
Miss Burke?
Aye, the woman who was living in my cottage with him.
Yes. Do you recall what she said?
Well, not all of it. I don't suppose she'd remember it all herself.
Well, on this occasion, she has testified that she accused you of trying to kill Jameson.
Aye, that and a lot more. How cruel I was, inhuman, she said. She was just screaming wild things. My wife heard her all the way up at our house. That's what brought her out.
Yes, now, Mr. Brimmer, we've heard Constable Lakins testify that he heard you say, "I warned them they were trespassing." Now, did you in fact say that, or did you say, "I warned them they were trespassing"?
Well, I remember saying something to myself, but I can't rightly say I can remember the exact words. I can tell you what I was thinking at the time.
Yes.
Well, I was thinking if only the two of them had cleared out when I asked them to, this never would have happened. If only they'd never come.
Yes, and at that time you also denied making a threatening visit to the cottage that morning with a gun.
Well, of course I do. The woman's lying.
But you did pay a visit to the cottage the evening before.
I did.
Yes. Now, Mr. Brimmer, I understand that the couple had been living for about a week in your cottage. How is it that you'd not been to see them before?
Well, I didn't know they were there until that day. I happened to meet a friend of mine in the village, and he said there were talk about these people. He had a good notion they were staying in my cottage. So, on the way back as I drove home that evening, I took the road that runs near the cottage, and I saw a light.
So you stopped to investigate?
I did.
Now, we both heard Mr. Jameson and Miss Burke's accounts of what happened that evening. Would you tell the court as fully and accurately as you can just what did occur?
Well, in the first place, it's not true what she said about my bursting in. I knocked twice. And then I called, "Who's in there?" Then it was she that pulled the door open very sudden-like, and she said in a very angry voice, "Who was I and what I thought I might be doing there?" Well, that surprised me, and I said, "Well, my cottage, it was more for me to ask her what she thought she might be doing there."
Yes, and how did she answer you?
Well, she said she was living there. And I said, "Well, it's private property, and she's no right to settle there without permission." And then she said, "Oh, yes, we have. We've got squatters' rights." I said I didn't know what she was talking about. Nor I did, until it was explained in this court yesterday. And then she said, laughing, "Catch up with the times, old man."
Yes. Mr. Brimmer, Miss Burke has testified that you were very angry and unpleasant from the very beginning of this encounter. Now, is that true?
Unpleasant? It wasn't me that was unpleasant. I told her she'd no call to be rude to me. And then she began to say things. I was more flabbergasted than angry. I've never heard a woman talk like that before, and I hope I never do again. It was unbelievable. She could use foul words and filthy language. She said she called me obscene names. I was revolted to listen to her. She was disgusting. It was like someone out of a sewer.
Join us tomorrow for the final day of The Queen against Brimmer. The trial of farmer Paul Brimmer enters its final day in the Crown Court. Brimmer has been charged with attempted murder and with wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. He admits to shooting at Sean Jameson on the night of November the 10th, but maintains that he thought he was firing at a fox. Jameson and his girlfriend, Angela Burke, were squatting in a cottage on Brimmer's land, and they claimed that the farmer called twice at the cottage and behaved in a threatening manner. Brimmer admits to calling only once on the couple and denies threatening them. It's come out in evidence that 3 years earlier, shortly after Brimmer and his wife moved to the village of Wenderby from Yorkshire, he was found guilty of firing a gun over the heads of 3 youths who were trespassing on his land. Paul Brimmer is in the witness box.
Mr. Brimmer, Miss Burke has testified that she told you during your visit to the cottage that she and Jameson had done some repair work, And she said that when she showed you some window coverings that they had put up, you went into a violent rage and tore them down.
No, it was her that tore them down. When she showed me, I said those would be the things they stole from my friend Bryant in Wenderby. Well, at that she went wild. Does he want them back, she said. And he can take them back if he thinks there is. And that's when she started to rip them all off the windows. And then she was crying and screaming and carrying on like someone possessed.
And it was after this that Jameson appeared.
Aye, I reckon it was the noise she was making that brought him out. He didn't say much at first. He were stumbling about and you could smell the drink on him.
Yes, now, Mr. Brimmer, both Jameson and Miss Burke have said that Jameson suggested